I want to introduce John Warner. John owns and operates a commercial photo studio in Asheville, North Carolina. His assignments range from industrial location shots to advertising and product illustration. However, he particularly enjoys his architectural photography. John has over 25 years of lighting and composition expertise and brings that to the world of indoor and exterior architectural photography. HDR has proven an invaluable tool for John on location and for annual report shots. His architectural clients include clients such as the Biltmore Estate, Michelin, and Volvo, among others. In his spare time, John also is an active beta tester for photographic products and services. He's worked on the Photoshop development and also has contributed to Unified Colors products. His insight and real life workflow tips were very helpful during the development of HDR Expose 2 in particular. He contributed greatly to the feature definitions and functionality that we'll find in the new batch operations tools, which we'll cover later on in this webinar. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome John Warner to the webinar. John, thanks for agreeing to host this webinar with us today. And why don't we get started by taking a look at some of your work and what can you tell us about it?
Great. Well, let me start by extending a thanks to you and to Unified Color for this opportunity and such cool software. So I'm going to go back in time because I actually started my business in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the slide on the screen is Asheville, where I have relocated just because it's such a cool arts and crafts. It's beer capital of the country, and at least in our minds. But I concentrated in architectural photography while in Charlotte. And since I have moved here, it's much more of a general commercial with annual report work and hospitality and so on. But it all involves lighting, which is wonderful. And the early days in Charlotte, I shot with the 4x5 CNR, transparency, color neg, black and white neg, 35 slide. And you know, clients never paid us to have the image too dark or too light. With transparency, it was simply right or it was off. And we shot a lot of Polaroid in those days, did a lot of strobe lighting. I used to joke that I think we must have educated several of the children of Polaroid employees through the years because we certainly bought our share of Polaroid. But so moving forward, we certainly still use a lot of lighting, and my choice for HDR is not because I don't want to lug lighting around, which is certainly a consideration, but there are a number of situations where HDR is the right tool. But I'm going to begin with a whole variety of shots from film-based, digital-based. Most of it has some degree of lighting. I'll also say that the economic forces probably argue at times for HDR. Every architectural job that I do, I usually insist on meeting with the client at the location and walk through and start to figure out the sorts of problems and solutions. And it's usually in that moment when I hear how many shots they want to get in a certain period of time. Of course, my bubble thought is you're kidding, right? But then I tend to think if I want that job, I know that I could funnel some of those shots into the HDR and keep it moving along. The elasticity of raw files in this day and age and the amazing amount of information doesn't mean that every shot is an HDR. I've been able to get some wonderful detail out of standard images. So I really look at HDR like I would look at a camera lens. I have a 24mm tilt shift in my bag. It's my go-to lens for architectural, but by no means is it my only lens, and I wouldn't want to be stuck with one lens only. And with the same thinking, I like to have choices going forward. One of the early goals was to preserve detail in the highlights, preserve detail in the shadows, and have a really nice, rich-looking mid-tone contrast and color. And speaking of color and clarity, I did clean my screen, John. Is it clear on your end? That was a joke. Okay, moving along here.
It looks great from this end.
So, good. So one of the things that I thought would be useful is I looked at HDR. I have very specific requirements and interest in it. I mean, nobody is going to pay me to do the grunge look, but the ability to get beautiful detail in highlights and shadows and keep the mid-tone looking good is really critical for my work. Hospitals need interiors, hospitality, restaurants, five-star inns, you name it. And here we shoot a panorama, which I'll show you some of my gear coming up. But one of the things I've found in this day and age is the more you can be relevant for your clients, the more they seem to call you for work. So it does kind of complicate your workflow. It means you've got to be willing to do more, where in the old days, the film days, I would drop my film off after a shoot, and really my job had been done. And in this day and age, my job really is only starting. So I'll speak more to that when we look at the batch functionality, which I really asked for and was very appreciative of with unified color. This is a multiple exposure painting with light result here, not an HDR. Here is a film-based shoot we did for a local hotel, and I've got strobes all throughout. Whenever I've got people in a scene, it's pretty much going to dictate that we use electronic flash. HDR is a little tricky to keep everybody holding still.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a strobe lit, actually a different technique that we use where I'm actually walking around the scene holding the flash as it does multiple exposures, and then I just do layers lighting and put it together. You know, each of these are techniques. They work in some situations. I pretty much know looking at a shot how I'm going to do it. This is back to 4x5 transparency. That's all strobe lit. The art director signed off on the Polaroids, and once that film came back from the lab, we were done.
So how do you, when you evaluate a scene like this, how do you decide when it's an HDR appropriate scene, or when is HDR not appropriate, and when would you light it? I think that's a question a lot of people have. Looking at a scene, is this something that I need HDR for? How do you judge the contrast range and decide when to implement the HDR functionality?
Well, of course, if it's an ideal world and a great budget, then I'm pretty much going to be lighting most of my shots. But one constraint would be if we have too many shots in a day, I tend to look for those complicated interiors with a lot of glass, things that will be hard to hide the strobe light. You'll have to put a lot of black paper up to hide the reflection. I quickly put those into an HDR mode. A different color balance of light, that's another ideal place. Yeah, I think those two things that and things that would be really tight spaces, that's another one. If I have to stick a strobe light in a tiny little bathroom, I will try to do an HDR every time. Even if I've lit the entire rest of the project, you're in a tight space, that's a great use for that.
Do you typically work with assistants, or are you on your own when you do these?
You know, it's interesting. I've used to work all the time with an assistant, and we did a lot of high-end properties work, and then the bubbles sort of blew, and I work with freelance assistants now, and I also work a lot alone because some of our projects I travel to, and the client's not always thrilled at buying 2 plane tickets. So, you sort of figure out or hire an assistant locally, but you sort of figure out, project by project.
Okay.
So this is my this is the Promote, which is a wonderful tool. I'm a Canon shooter. I was a Nikon shooter for years. When I switched to digital, however, they didn't have a full frame sensor. So in that time, I went with the full frame solution, and it was costly enough that I was told by my studio manager, who happens to be my wife, that I get one chance at that in a career. So I have made my jump and have never looked back. It's been great. And so the 5D Mark III, I'm actually preferring the files from this to the original 1DS Mark III. And I'm also doing some video projects, so I like this camera for that.
And the Promote is the device on the bottom of this picture. Why don't you explain to folks how that works, and how that overcomes some of the bracketing limitations of the Canon cameras?
Yeah, this is a brilliant piece of work here. Depending on the camera you have, it may or may not have a wide bracketing function. And I typically shoot 8 one-stop exposure brackets from the metered value and then up and down, 8 to 10, somewhere in there. And I have a rock solid tripod. And when you hook up the promote, it does the math for you. You tell it where you want your exposure, where you want the spread, and how many shots you want. And it does all of that for you. You never touch the camera. The camera remains very still. And I think that helps the quality at the post-production end, because you've got your whole range of photographs. The first thing, and I didn't show this, is I have an Expo disc that I use to check the color balance and then dial in and then use the promote. And for my wild 360 work, I've got the Swiss round shot VR Drive 2, which is quite a piece of work, but it has an HDR capability inside as well. So it'll do any kind of panorama, up and down, left and right, gigapixel. I can even put a video, use this as a video turntable. So
yeah, that brings us to two other questions that I think I want to get out of the way first now, because they're coming up quite regularly here. The first question is, how many shots do you usually take when you bracket a scene? And I have my answer, and I know you have one. So let's hear what you do.
I typically settle in around 8. If it's contrasty, and I always look at the histogram. I do a quick, before I get the promote involved, I look at where I think I want the high end and the low end, and look at the histogram, and that sort of guides me. But I think 8 is a pretty average number. You can always throw those away later. You can't reshoot it.
And so that's my shoot first, ask questions later theory then.
Exactly.
What bracket, what increments are you shooting at?
Typically one stop, although I will tell you that I call workflow, my workflow I call workflow du jour, because I'm always revising it. It never seems like I can just sort of, stick with something. The operating system's always changing, new things come along, and I'm always discovering better ways to do things. So my answer for today only is one stop.
Okay. The other question is regarding video. You just kind of mentioned it a little bit with the 5D Mark III. How much is video part of your repertoire now for your architectural clients? And I mean, do you see a use for HDR video in the future?
Oh, absolutely, totally. I try to build myself as a solution in search of a problem. And once people find out that I do something, we tend to get that work. Architects really love kind of motion graphics. So we've done time lapse of different projects. And, it started with the whole panorama. I could give them a different look at their project that they couldn't get with a straight camera. And sometimes architects want talking heads. They want their clients talking. So, and this may be 30% of what we do now, is to shoot and edit video.
Okay, great. So now we're going to do a product demo, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I am in HDR Expose, and I go up to the left-hand side and click the reset to bring our image into 32-bit viewing. So
well, you mentioned that this was a file that you already had merged. This is a 32-bit BEF file that you're starting with, right?
That is exactly right. Yes, John, thank you. The problem is I have the knowledge, I just can't always get to it in real time. But yeah, this was pre-merged, it's 32-bit, and it doesn't tell you a lot, and yet these fine people give you this wonderful display zone up here, and as you slide this left and right, you're really just beginning to discover what's happening in your highlights and shadows. It's not affecting the image, it's just giving you a preview, and it's a great way to begin to investigate a shot. When you're done with that little exercise, if you double click it, it goes back to the correct rendering for that. And as I go through here, I'm going to start to recover the highlights. Now, one can use the automatic tone mapping, which is a wonderful feature, and that's a starting point. There really are probably 3 or 4 different ways of working this way. You can come over to the left and use their tone map linear, which is a wonderful starting point, and that recovers a lot of information, highlights, and shadow. And you can see that the tone map linear has done good things for our histogram. It's placed our points of interest between highlights and shadows. But I consider this a great starting point. I don't think I would want to stop here, but it's a terrific starting point. And I'd like to have a little more information in a little more guts in the shadows and a little bit of local contrast. I just think it'll help to define this sort of delicate areas here in the arch. And I often will bring the black point up a little bit as well, just because I think it gives it just a little more dynamic range, a little more guts. I'm not going to demonstrate the dodge and burn, although I do use that in this shot. I'm not going to be working with that, but I would like to give this a little bit of saturation. And one might want to warm this up even more, just a little bit. Again, this is all to taste. At this point, I've gotten tremendous detail in and out, and
yeah, we
if
should
you find that you go ahead.
Mention on this as well that all of these changes you're doing now, this is just a sample of what you would do on a typical single image. All of these are being done on the full 32-bit HDR image data of the image. So you can get very fine gradations in terms of the changes that you make. Also, the tonal adjustments that you're making are only done on the brightness channel of the image. So we're not inducing any color shifts or any changes at all to the color as we manipulate the tone.
Also, I think the fact that this is so interactive, the fact that you can make an exposure change, even a drastic one, and it's very quick in the dodge and burn. But if I were to play with my tone mapping a little bit, it really is very quick. It's the way to work, because it comes it comes right back and gives you real-time visual cues as to how your image is evolving here.
All right, I just want to mention some people had a question about the version of software you're using. This is HDR Expose 2, this current product that's available on our website as a free 30-day trial download if you want to try it out.
I'm also running Mountain Lion on my MacBook Pro, and I'm using the Canon 5D Mark III files, and all of the HDR software is compatible with that.
Great.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, once I get a setting that I like, and I think that I might have similar ones from the shoot, I can come down here and add this preset. And I'll just come up with a name, and once I've done that, it populates over here in the left-hand column. If you decide at some point that a preset is not working for you, you go up to your preferences and you can delete it there. But that's where these are all maintained and where they are discoverable. So I'm not going to carry this through to a 16-bit. I wanted to show you my basic workflow with an individual image, but I usually start before now in the batch mode. Now, when I've done a major shoot, I often have a fair number of shots that have been lit. I've got panoramas. I've got shots that need to be merged to HDR, and so there's a lot of work waiting at the end of the day of shooting. And one of the things I love about this software is being able to go and target the raw folder from a shoot and let HDR Expose do all of the math in trying to figure out the grouping of shots. And this is quite a thing with all the modern computers with the multi-threaded processors, and RAM is finally affordable. When I was growing up, you had to mortgage your house and put your firstborn on the block to get a megabyte of RAM. But
Yeah.
These
On
are
that note, what system are you working on now? What's your the configuration of this device that you're demoing with?
I've got, well, I should have checked that before, but I think that I've got, yeah, 8 gigs of RAM, and it's
It's a MacBook Pro.
MacBook Pro,
Okay.
2.2 gigahertz.
Well, that was
So
the
one,
question that come in.
yeah, one of the things that one can do when you're in batch mode. Now you can see that this auto stack images. This has allowed it to intelligently group the shots that belong together. That is huge. I don't have to. All I had to do was target a folder. You can come in and investigate each thumbnail. I've done my own testing, and I haven't found a quality difference. I mean, I could take this out of the queue, for example, but I usually just let it run as it is because I'm going to be walking away and doing something else. And with multi-threaded machines, I can actually let Expose work on a batch in the background and then go back into Lightroom and be doing other things. So it's a really great way to get the process started. And when I'm finished with the shoot, I want to get the process started. So I've targeted the raw file. I now want to create the 32-bit BEF file. And so you indicate that. And I've done this beforehand, so I don't take up your time. And I think this is an especially satisfactory way to work to process, to tone map at least 5 different examples at the end. You get up to 5, as I recall.
Yeah, we should
And so,
mention here that usually the batch processing is consists of 2 steps. The first step is to do the batch merge. That's when we'll take all the individual raw files that you have shown here, and then we'll merge them together into a 32-bit HDR file. The second step is the processing, which we showed you in the first segment there, where you would do all the controls and create your presets and apply them to an image. So the batch processing we can do in 2 steps. We do the first step is to create the HDR images, and then the second step is to take those HDR images and then apply presets to them and batch process them to output. We have here with this checkbox called process to final, which John has just selected. This will allow you to do everything from start to finish in one fell swoop. So, John, you said you like this one because it lets you have dinner with your family when you come home from a shoot.
well, I am in a craft beer city, so there's dinner and whatever else. But I just like the idea that something's happening. Um, Things are happening. Now, my theory is that once you build these BEF files, and you actually build the 16-bit in this case, and I use ProPhoto as the profile, you know, I may or may not use those. I'm going to switch over and show you these in Bridge in a minute. But they at least give me a starting point. So when I go back and individually tweak the BEF files, I have much more information. And plus, this is all done without my having to do a thing. So I'm not going to. Oh, another nice thing is if I say OK to this and it begins the background processing, I can actually still open BEF files and continue to work. And I don't know how they've done it to work in the background like that. But for this example, unless you want to see something else, John, I'm going to close this window.